Excellent. Well, technology tried to go on strike today, but we exploited it and management was able to win. But thank you everyone for coming, and thank you everyone here, and thank you everyone for online. I also want to thank the Department of Sociology and Criminology for co-sponsoring this event with Max. Just to give a very little bit of background, this is a seminar for COVER, which is the Research Center for Commons Organizing, Values, Equalities, and Resilience. And what we're trying to be is a kind of global leader in really thinking about the ways in which commons as a principle and commons resource ownership as a development strategy can help bring about post-capitalist transitions, both within organizations, workplaces, communities, nationally and globally. So I can't think of anyone more exciting for us to have a seminar today than Max, whose work, I mean, when we were talking last week, I think there was one point in which I was said, I would love to know what your actual background is, because you've written so many amazing works in so many different fields, from political economy on to the work that you're doing now around game development and radical imagination. But I really think it's important because, in a certain sense, a key aspect of trying to create these radical transitions is allowing people the opportunity to imagine a different type of economy, society, and world. And when we use the term imagination, I think we kind of use it as this kind of vague term or an inspiring term, but actually the process of reimagination is something that involves a lot of critical thought and rigor. And it also involves itself in coming to be part of a fundamental revolutionary praxis, right? And I think we've seen just in the most recent bourgeois election of last night that the failure to create practices of radical imagination has all sorts of authoritarian results. So for myself, and I'm sure for everyone here, having Max's work, which I really think is at the forefront of saying, what do we mean when we're saying to imagine? What are we asking people to do? What is the process involved in this? And what are the rigorous ways it should inform a praxis of radical change? Is probably more needed now than in any time I can think of. So thank you so much, Max, for that.
Thank you. Thanks for that lovely introduction on a otherwise dark and stormy day. Let's see here. Yeah, that's a bit better. Nice to see also folks in the Zoom room. We'll sort of be DJing between two computers here. So yes, it's going to be good. Yes, thank you again for the introduction. I thought what I would do for you today is something that maybe would appear a bit less like a research talk and more like an artist talk, in the sense that I'm going to kind of go through a bunch of projects that I've been doing over the last 10 years, essentially, and try and pick out some common threads. All of these projects sort of evolved from some work I did about a decade ago, that got published a decade ago in a book titled The Radical Imagination, which I co-authored with my friend Alex Kasnavich. Alex and I found each other when we were both in graduate school in Canada at McMaster University. He was in anthropology and I was at first in globalization studies, and then I ended up doing a PhD in English and cultural studies. And I teach now in an English department, which is curious. But I've moved around between lots of different departments, between the social sciences and humanities in my strange academic scam career. Also, I'm working on a book on scams, so I'm obsessed with scams. I'd love to talk to anyone about scams. Nonetheless, when we were working together, we were also quite involved in graduate student and precarious academic organizing at our university in Canada through the Canadian Union of Public Employees. At the time, Alex was studying the global resonances of Zapatismo, so the ways in which the example and the stories and the images of the Zapatista struggle in Chiapas had resonated with social movements around the world. And I was doing my PhD on what would become the sort of source, the main area in which I've done most of my publication, which is a field that became known as critical finance studies. At the time, I was looking at the relationship between theories of value and theories of imagination, particularly trying to understand the way imaginary money gets created. And, you know, the story behind that is basically all money is imaginary, but financial money is extra imaginary. So I was looking at the production of financial imaginaries. And that led us to sort of come together both as friends and collaborators around some of our frustrations at the time with what had become fairly mainstream in social movement studies. And wanting to devise a project that we felt would do social movement studies in solidarity with grassroots, anti-authoritarian, autonomous social movements that would somehow give more to those movements than it extracted from them. I mean, it probably wouldn't surprise anyone here to learn that a lot of social science research has been extractive, and that includes a lot of research on social movements. And we wanted to first create a project that we could do in solidarity with movements that would not be extractive, or would at least be more beneficial to the movements than extractive from them, but also that would tie together our interest in theoretical interest in the imagination. We'd both read and been quite influenced at that time, of course, by the writings of the Zapatistas, which are very imaginative and also champion the imagination. We were doing this work in Canada at a time when Indigenous uprisings were were cresting. They've continued to crest, actually, in many ways. But there also the power of stories and the power of imagination is very present. And we had also both shared an interest in the work of the French-Greek philosopher Cornelius Castoriadis, whose work on the radical imagination still in some ways guides a lot of my thinking and was really behind this book, The Radical Imagination, which we published in 2014. The book was based on basically 3 years of deep ethnographic participatory research in the small Canadian city of Halifax. Halifax, oh, I see some chats. I just want to make sure that, yeah, okay. Good, everything's working there. In the small Canadian city of Halifax, for those of you who have been to Halifax, you will be able to confirm when I say that a revolutionary change is not coming to Halifax, Canada anytime soon. Probably not within our lifetimes, probably not within anyone's lifetime. It is a very conservative place that was established as a military garrison by the British in the 1750s. Charles Dickens once visited the city and said it was like looking at London through the wrong end of a telescope and he'd never be back. And when you've pissed off Charles Dickens, who in many ways was an arch reactionary, you know you've done something. So I would say we wanted to study social movements in that project in a state of perpetual failure. And I say that as someone who was participating in movements there. My parents live there. My brother lives there. They're all activists. Many of my best friends live there and are activists. But we wanted to actually study what movements looked like in a state of kind of a chronic state, as we put it in that project, between success and failure, where they're neither completely succeeding in their stated goals of changing various aspects of society, but nor are they completely failing and falling apart. They're somewhere in the middle, in what we ended up calling in this book the hiatus between success and failure. We studied many different movements. We decided we also wanted to study not just a specific movement, but something that we think exists much more readily in cities and localities, which is social movement milieus, where multiple social movements are interacting with each other. Most of the movements we studied, whether they were feminist movements, queer movements, student movements, anti-racist movements, movements around on housing and homelessness, etc., that were active in the city, made up of people who identified as radicals. Most of these movements, we realized, often lacked formal organizations. Their memberships tended to bleed in and out of one another. Social relationships in a small city like this are very rich and very nuanced and very tangled in both very beautiful and very ugly ways. So we wanted to study the milieu rather than a particular movement that has a particular identity or membership base. We wanted to look at the interaction of people in the space. So we did that for a number of years. We did long, unstructured interviews with participants, asking them questions like, what would it mean to win? What's one thing you would say to everyone else in the movement if you could, but that you don't feel you're allowed to say? we asked people about their histories, long descriptions. We asked them, in many ways, we asked them what hurt also, because struggling for a different world in a world that doesn't change is harmful to us all. It is hard. And so we almost in some ways, as researchers, took on a slightly therapeutic role as well. And we would then organize events with people in the social movement milieu in Halifax to bring them together, also to discuss some of the common issues that we heard. We ended up working with the different movements and organizations to host public film screenings at the public library and bring them in as speakers to help them reach broader audiences. And we generally tried to think about our work in this project as being infrastructural, to becoming an infrastructure that supported movements of explicitly people who consider themselves radicals, and particularly people who we would probably associate with the left wing of the political spectrum. That is to say, people concerned with a project of collective liberation rather than personal enrichment or reactionary politics. But we tried to imagine what it would mean for us as researchers to become infrastructural, to actually create something that would provide something for the movements. And this was something that I think distinguished us from a lot of other social movement studies projects at the time and today. Although I think this trend there's a trend moving in this direction, as from what I understand of that interdisciplinary field. We distinguished our strategy, which we called convocation, from two other strategies that we identified as avocation and invocation. So these don't necessarily describe particular methodologies. I think they spread across multiple methodologies, but they describe a certain orientation to working with movements and communities. On the one hand, we talked about a strategy of invocation, which is where the researcher goes out and does research on a community. Often, I mean, almost always nowadays with their consent, but often also in consultation with that community. And then the researcher comes back to the proverbial academy and writes about it and shares that information, often sharing that information with the movements themselves so they can know themselves better, so that they can know one another better. But the idea is that, in our view, this is invoking the movement. You're sort of observing it, writing about it, theorizing it, and giving that back to the world. And both Alex and I have done that. I mean, Alex did that with his work on Zapatismo. I've done it in other work that I've done. But for various reasons, which we could go into if you're interested, we found that to be slightly dissatisfying for the project that we wanted to do. The second strategy, which we also wanted to avoid, is one that we called avocation, from the Latin word for calling away from. And there you often see social movement researchers basically go to social movements and be like, hey, I'm an academic with like access to resources, theoretically at least, maybe not in the UK these days. How can I serve you? How can I do research for the movement? How can I participate in the movement as a researcher? Setting aside my academic needs, putting them at least secondary, if not tertiary, and serving the movement in various ways. And for various reasons, both Alex and I have done this work, and I continue to do it in various ways, which I could talk about if you wish. But we were also dissatisfied with that. And we came up with this third strategic container, which we called convocation, for the Latin word for calling together. And what we really want to experiment with there, as I was mentioning, is like, what is the particular role that an academic researcher can play in a social movement milieu that makes us infrastructural and allows us to do something with movements and for movements that movements are not necessarily doing for themselves? What is it? How can we mobilize with all criticalness and with all self-criticism and questioning? How can we mobilize the strange privilege that we are afforded within this particular society in which we live as academics to do something with the social movements for which we feel an affinity that they can't do for themselves, so they're not doing for themselves? For various reasons, as you can probably already identify, there's a bunch of risks and hazards to doing this. But what it led us to is the idea that as researchers, we could, for instance, gain the trust of a lot of different people and do that kind of para-therapeutic work of like actually asking people what they thought and felt, asking them where the pain was, asking them, to share with us their fears and misgivings, not because we were going to report on it in our research. We've never written about it and published about it, and we won't. but simply because we want to offer a space that is not otherwise being offered to movements. Also, to ask a question like, what would it mean to win? There's very few times that actually movements create those spaces for themselves. Some very structured groups will sometimes do strategy sessions, maybe like once a year or once every 3 or 5 years, where they might ask themselves, what is our broader vision of change, theory of change, strategy, tactics? But that in and of itself is quite rare. What's even rarer is to do that in social movement milieus, where organizations tend to be very amorphous and changeable and don't last very long and bleed into one another. There's no one who's necessarily going to ask those questions unless some researcher shows up and does it. Or to ask, for instance, the question, what is it you wish you could say to the rest of the movement that you can't say? And then for us as researchers who are at least relatively neutral, to be able to bring a bunch of activists or movement participants in a room and say, look, one of the things we heard that 10 people out of the 20 people we interviewed said was really bothering them is this. What do you think about it? And then that opens a discussion that otherwise wouldn't happen. These are some of the things that we were trying to do in the Radical Imagination Project. And it led us to theorize a couple of things about the radical imagination to help us even explain our method to ourselves. One of them is that, as Peter was mentioning, unfortunately, the mechanical thing is nice. Oh, cute. The windows are opening for the people in the Zoom room. It's very impressive. There's a robot among us. One of the things is that, as Peter was mentioning, both the term radical and the term imagination are often thrown about without a great deal of rigor. And as an academic, that frustrates me because obviously I think we should have some degree of rigor with our terms, although I think terms are also flexible. And meaning is, of course, a matter of constant negotiation. Here's the English literature side of me coming out. At the same time, I think it's problematic because actually there's something very useful about the imagination and the term radical that bears defining. And so in the book, we do some work to try and define both terms. We borrow the meaning of radical from Castoriadis, who thinks about the radical imagination as not just like the thing that radical people have that allows them to think, oh, wouldn't it be great if we had a world without poverty or patriarchy or whatever. No, for him, the radical imagination is a much more elemental force in society. It is the substance out of which social institutions are formed. And here he means social institutions not only in terms of, like a university, but also like the police or like marriage. We could even extend it to notions of gender or to almost any set of meanings that structure our shared material reality that are held in place by stories, impressions, ideology, and the work of the imagination. For him, he has this beautiful description, metaphor of the radical imagination as a magma, that substance between rock and between solid and liquid, that sort of flows beneath the mantle of the earth, and occasionally erupts through volcanoes and tectonic shifts. And when the magma reaches the surface, and when it's exposed to the atmosphere, it hardens into rock. And this is the social institutions that are all around us. And we, who are born into these and socialized into these social institutions, we take them for eternal and natural and normal and unchangeable. But in fact, they are simply the momentary solidifications of the imagination, destined to be swept away again in future upheavals of the radical imagination as well. For Castoriadis, this is not only true of social institutions, it's also true of our identities as well, the self that we think we are. Castoriadis was a kind of weird dissident in that strange meeting point in the mid-20th century between Marxism and psychoanalysis. But I think his theories offer an extremely dynamic and quite inherently anti-authoritarian view of how to bring together the questions of material and psychological and sociological instituting. So this led us to a very simple formulation from the radical imagination, which is that the radical imagination is not something that individuals possess. It is something that collectives do together. And they do together when they struggle. The radical imagination isn't just something that you generate by sitting around and talking about how wonderful it would be to be in a world where there was more recycling, whatever. The radical imagination is something that sparks in the moment when people come together and challenge power, challenge authority, challenge the dominant systems. And one of the arguments that we made in the book is that the radical imagination and powerful visions that another future might be possible, another world might be possible, they don't lead people to revolt. They emerge as people revolt, and they emerge from the new social relations and the new institutions people begin to build when they work together to change the world. And that can be as large as creating a commune, a whole section of a city that rises up and declares itself autonomous or something like that. But it can also be just on the level of friendships, on the level of the worlds that we create with in the intimacies of our everyday life as well. Those are also sources of the radical imagination because they often run counter to the dominant logics of the systems in which we live. Not always, and not always completely perfectly. Autonomy is always a struggle and a negotiation, but nonetheless. So over the last 10 years since we published The Radical Imagination, I've taken the inspiration and the methodologies and the strategy of that book into a variety of other projects, which now I want to turn to in this presentation. And I'm going to go through them obviously quite quickly because I want to demonstrate maybe demonstrate to myself a kind of continuity. And my hope is that there will be a continuity between them. But all of them, I would say, take these sort of principles that we discovered in doing the research with movements in the radical imagination and try and move them into different registers. So a couple of years after that, I started working with collaborators to organize research walks of various cities. And we ended up doing two. The first one, I believe, was in 2018, was a walk of the City of London to investigate financialization in the built environment. This I organized with my colleague at UCL, Aris Comparozos Athanasiou, who also we share an interest in Castoriadis and the radical imagination and financialization. Here we invited academics, artists, and activists to select points in the City of London where they would make a short 15-minute presentation about something that was a connection between financialization and the imagination. Obviously, financialization is an incredibly complex process. Finance capital is profoundly confusing and mystical in many ways. So we wanted to actually have an investigation of it that would be grounded in physical space. And we also wanted to bring together people who are not just researchers, but also artists and activists, people who are researching and thinking through these questions from other perspectives as well. So through a process of both an invitations and an open call, we had, I believe, 15 or so different locations that we walked to over the course of I think it was a Saturday, in the city, the famous square mile where most of the UK's financial services industry is based. And we had a really interesting set of conversations, for instance, about the origins of mutuality in mutual aid societies in the 18th century. We had one presentation on the incorporation of yoga into the financial dispositif. We had a presentation on derivatives trading around the sentiment of fear. We had a presentation on the history of Jewish life and anti-Semitism in the city and how that's connected to kind of misinformation and misdirection around financialization. We had a presentation on settler colonialism and finance in the history of the city, political risk management, playgrounds and the management of children and children's lives in the city, and alchemy and gold, and much more. And what was really interesting about this walk is that, first of all, we were able to bring together all of these different knowledge holders, knowledge producers, to use that strange language. But also it offered this really interesting kind of framework of sociality, because we were able to not only hear people's different presentations, but also feel it in our bodies, feel it in the embodied space. And also a lot of very interesting conversations and collaborations began to happen as we walked from station to station of the walking tour. We also recorded all of the speeches and presentations, and they're available as a self-guided audio tour and podcast via UCL. I repeated this also with my colleagues Stephanie Springay and Sarah Truman in Toronto the subsequent year. And this was a walking tour of Toronto's financial district to investigate the links between financialization, settler colonialism, and the extractive industry. The Toronto Stock Exchange is headquarters to, at that time, I think somewhere between 40 and 60%, depending on how you crunch the numbers, of exploratory mining firms. It's a real global hub for the destruction of the planet in the name of profit. So this tour, again, was able to bring together activists, artists, writers, and researchers, again, to create a different kind of convivial atmosphere for generating the radical imagination in certain ways. But on a slightly different theme. Sadly, we were planning a bunch more, and then the pandemic happened, and we never went back to walking tours. But if you want to organize one, I'd love to work with you. It's a very interesting way of doing collective research. And also many members of the public came in both cases to learn. One of the other things I've been doing over the last few years is really getting into podcasting. I mean, who hasn't, especially after the pandemic? And in fact, the project, the first podcast that we produced with the aforementioned Aris Comparozos Athanasio at UCL. Yeah. Oh, I forgot to change this. Yeah. Thank you. There we go. At UCL was on anxiety. And Aris and I were trying to understand, both of us share an interest in how financialization transforms subjectivity. We're particularly interested in how it transforms the subjectivity of the youngest adults in our society. And we had designed a project before the pandemic hit to study this through the so-called epidemic of student anxiety on UK university campuses, which I'm sure all of you are intimately familiar with. You might also be intimately familiar with the way that students are castigated for being overly coddled and overly anxious by their elders, especially more reactionary elders. But we wanted to suggest that, in fact, perhaps the anxiety that so many young people feel emerges from being the first fully financialized generation, where they understand and have been raised to understand themselves as tragic risk managers in an economy that is probably going to kill them, which I think is actually a very reasonable reason to be very anxious. Unfortunately, the pandemic got in the way of us doing actually a much more involved radical imagination style project with students on UK campuses, where we would have gone around doing workshops and building kind of artistic projects with the students. And instead, we moved towards doing a podcast where we interviewed a variety of, again, activists, artists, and experts on this question of anxiety and what it means in this particular moment of capitalism. The podcast offered a really lovely way of doing what I call like research in public, because obviously these are people whose work we were reading, who had piqued our interest as researchers when we were doing the background research for the project on anxiety. And it offered us a way to reach out to people and actually create a kind of research community that, again, bled out beyond just the confines of academia, much more broadly. The subsequent year, we did a follow-up podcast on conspiracies in games and gamification. And then we did a podcast on Amazon, the company, and science fiction, which I'll talk about in 1 second here. The latest one that we did was on games and capitalism. Oh, yes, thank you. This is the one on gamification, and this is the one on Amazon. And this is the one on games and gamification. Though I think the most project I'm proudest of that I recently did is one that just came to a close called Worker is Futurist. So basically what we did, me and a small team that included Xenia Benevolsky, Sarah Olatula, and Graham Webb, is we ran science fiction writing groups for rank and file Amazon workers, so they could write short stories about the world after Amazon. Very briefly, Amazon is a corporation, as you know, that's basically taken over vast swaths of the economy and runs it, in the words of Yanis Varoufakis, as a kind of fiefdom, with almost complete unilateral and authoritarian control over huge swaths of the logistics industry, massive share in the book industry, electronics, etc. Amazon has become an incredibly dominant corporation, and also one that is in some ways pioneering new forms of capitalist management of workers and of consumers as well, through their incredibly jealous cultivation of data and their incredibly ambitious and I would say almost totalitarian use of that data through algorithmic management in various ways. Amazon presents itself to the world as almost a science fiction entity. And indeed, its founder, Jeff Bezos, is, by his own admission, one of the world's largest science fiction fans. He is a billionaire, formerly the world's richest man, who plowed billions and billions of dollars into his own private space program to fulfill his dream of taking humanity to the stars and leaving Earth as a nature reserve that can be visited as humanity's Blue Origin, which is the source of the name of his space company. If Amazon is in some ways a science fiction story for its shareholders, for regulators, for its corporate executives, if it is a utopian dream for them, then it is a dystopian nightmare for the vast majority of its workers, who are heavily exploited and suffer incredibly excruciating and grueling forms of work in warehouses and out as delivery drivers. And our question was, if in some ways these workers are being exploited to produce a future for someone else, what are their visions of the future, right? They're essentially located by Amazon as bodies, as basically the meat in a vast digital machine that is only going to be there as long as their labor is cheaper than producing a robot. And it will continue to be cheaper than producing a robot for a very long time to come. The dream of a fully automated Amazon is a long, long way off, even though that's what the company tells its shareholders and the public. Nonetheless, our question was, well, if that is the destiny that Amazon is offering to workers, what are the hopes and dreams and fears and nightmares of workers themselves? And what are the circumstances under which these could be brought to the public? And how could the process of creative writing and exercising the imagination be part of efforts by workers and others to mobilize the imagination in solidarity with struggles to organize it? And that led to the publication of this book, which just came out last month, The World After Amazon, featuring 9 short stories by 9 workers from around North America, based on workshops that we did with them on Zoom, and a long editing process, which I could speak about more if you wish. The book was released physically as a print, but also in electronic format for free online, and also as an audiobook, because we heard from workers that they, thank you, that they wished to be able to listen to it while on the job. And we're now pursuing collaborations with trade union organizers and community organizers in the US and Canada to integrate creative writing into sort of the labor and community organizing process as a sort of supplement to their organizing efforts. Because on some level, it's very easy with a company like Amazon, which is so incredibly powerful and so stitched into everyday life, to simply articulate opposition, which is, I think, important. But we also need to create spaces for proposition, not only for the no, but also the yes. And to do that, I think actually researchers have an interesting role to play. So this project very much feels to me as a continuation of some of the ideas and some of the approaches that we developed in the Radical Imagination Project. Just as a teaser, I will say that one of the other ventures that I'm engaged in right now is to start a new imprint for promoting and producing radical games for Pluto Press, the radical press from London. This spring, we'll be launching a game called Billionaires and Guillotines. And this is an attempt to also think through the affordances, especially of board games and analog games and role-playing games, also as a venue to bring people together in convivial experiences to catalyze the convocation of the radical imagination as well. But I want to move to Q&A because some things might be interesting or less interesting, but I'm happy to talk a bit more about the game if you want. Also, if you're in London, we'll be playing it tomorrow night at the launch of the Historical Materialism Conference. So come on by. Pluto's buying drinks, so it's going to be a fun time. I'll leave it there and look forward to chatting with you about all of these things. And for the folks on Zoom, yes, you can speak up. I think the people will probably hear you from my computer, but if they don't, then I can repeat your question. Yeah, yeah.
Oh, am I the chair? Excellent. I can't see if people are asking questions online.
You won't be able to see.
Not yet. No, I guess I wanted to start off, obviously, I think, what you're doing is really important and not just interesting, but important and significant. And I think it very much aligns with a lot of the work that a lot of us here are doing. But I guess so. Some of these questions are probably things that you thought deeply about, and I wanted to just explore a bit more from a kind of point of view of, I would say, kind of intellectual solidarity. The first is, I think the point about proposition is absolutely right. How do we, as part of integrating this into a praxis of movement and future building, not allow this to become an ethos of escapism? So I really like the point about, it reminds me of spending most of my teenage years and my 20s working horribly alienating jobs and listening to hardcore punk while doing it, literally during the job.
Yeah.
And at the time, it was quite an empowering thing. It's like, as two scholars in our field once wrote about cynicism from the Spicer, it's almost like McDonald's is perfectly happy for you to wear the McShit shirt under your uniform as long as you're getting that burgers. So that's the kind of point. I mean, and I know this is not one answer, but I mean, how do we not allow this to become just another kind of modified escapist experience? And then,
did you folks on Zoom hear that, or do you want me to repeat it? Yeah, they heard it. Okay, great.
I think the other part, and it's just because of the work that you've kind of done in other areas, and I think, in a very kind of Marxist sense here, what can we say from your experience about the kind of labor of imagination? I think sometimes when we think about imagination, we're either thinking about it in a kind of, traditional liberal notion of, it's imagination, or we think about it in very kind of like neoliberal consultant mode, like, but actually we're asking people to involve themselves in labor. You're doing labor, bringing these things. And what does it say not only about, the labor that's involved in this, but also if we did have a different world, right, or a different economy, what is the labor of imagination that would be part of a post-capitalist regime?
Yeah, it's a great question. To your first question, I think, yeah, absolutely. There is a huge risk that creating these opportunities for imagination become, pure escapism, or like a safety valve, or even more cynically, like it just as like window dressing for horrible things. Like I've done a lot of work in various ways against like developers, like property developers and urban capitalism in various ways. And one of the things they love to do is like have these bullshit consultation sessions where they're like, oh, we're consulting everyone about like how we're going to build this new beautiful building. And in fact, they actually hire people who do very good jobs of like cultivating people's imaginations, and ultimately then they just throw the stuff in the garbage and build what they were going to build anyway, or build it with now a thing in the basement called the Commons, which is, some horrible private security nonsense, the story. So I think there's a lot of dangers, and I think that's actually becoming more and more prevalent under this moment of capitalism, where not only are we given fewer and fewer chances to actually change anything meaningful, but we're also told that we should all be cultivating and harnessing and maximizing our imaginations as a means of survival. Like, I think the dominant idiom of at least capitalism of the global north, but increasingly everywhere, is like, cultivate your imagination and harness it so you can be like a good entrepreneurial subject and imagine your way out of your own poverty, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's a huge risk, and I think we need to like talk about it. I guess for me, methodologically, it's more about how do you bring people together so that they realize that the imagination is a collective force, and through doing imaginative work together, realize that they're already building another kind of world. And then that might actually change the structures of desire on some level, and the forms of affinity and the forms of subjectivity. So in this sense, I think with the Amazon workers, we could have done a project where we just like commissioned them to write for us, but we actually wanted them to come together, in this case on Zoom rooms, and actually see one another and hear from one another's experience and coach one another and encourage one another to stimulate a process of transformation ultimately.
Right.
So I think it's about those kind of collectivities, but I also think it's about encouraging and being honest about conflicts. Like when we did the Amazon project, we were like, look, there is a fundamental conflict between Jeff Bezos and the workers. Jeff Bezos would like to say, I'm just an imaginative guy like you. I just got lucky. But no, he's exploiting these people. He's destroying their bodies so that he can have a space program. There is a class conflict here. And we like, if I don't think the imagination is worth very much if it can't be honest about the structures and systems of power that exist. On the second level, the labor of the imagination, it's a really good question. I've been struggling with it for years. I think in some of my early work, maybe about 10 years ago, I was really struggling to articulate, and this was also when I was doing my PhD, to articulate a link between a labor theory of value and a materialist theory of the imagination. And I could go into that in more detail, we could talk, but I think the basis of it is to realize that like all labor is imaginative, and all imagination, if it's going to be meaningful, is also based on labor. Like the subject who imagines is a subject that has been produced by reproductive and commodity producing labor. We are all, you know, the products of labor of others, so that we can even have imagination. And if we, you know, come together in a space to imagine something together, someone has built that space, someone has fed us, someone has raised us from infants, you know. So like the on one level, the imagination is just a materialization of like embodied encoded labor. On the other hand, I think that like a lot of what capitalism does, especially in an era when it's invested in our subjectivities and our mentalities and not just the exploitation of our bodies, is to try and harness and excite and seduce and shape our imaginations as well. And you know, if we go back to Castoriadis's notion that all social institutions are in some part solidifications of the imagination, I think we could say the same about every commodity on some level. Every commodity is also a solidification of the imagination. It's not only that, you know, and it's easier to see that, of course, with like intangible commodities like intellectual property, but I think it's true of all commodities, including the most important commodity under capitalism, which is the labor, the thing that has labor power in it. Yeah.
If I'm gonna share, I'll come up to IC.
And also, if you folks want to do it,
I can also look on here. I did the horrible thing. I didn't know I was sharing, so I asked the first question, and that's like the worst. Like you guys should come through. Is there anyone in the room who would like to ask a question? Okay, Stephen, and then yourself, and then if there's anyone online.
Okay, so just quickly curious about like the short stories. The word after Amazon. Is it more like dystopia or utopia or critical dystopias, or and like in general, like the exercise of the Zoom writing groups, was it more like veering towards one or the other?
Yeah, great question. Most of the stories are dystopian. Some of the stories, I wouldn't say any of them are utopian, but some of them do feature a revolutionary struggle. And they imply there's a utopian moment after Amazon, but most of them are very dystopian. And we didn't encourage that. The only prompt that we gave them was, what will the world be like after Amazon? And we left that also ambiguous. Is it like after Amazon has transformed the world and it still exists? After Amazon has been abolished? After Amazon has destroyed the world? Like what? And so the workers came up with lots of different responses to that. My observation, well, I'll share my colleague Xenia's observation first. Xenia observed that a lot of the workers had a dystopian imagination because most of the workers were under the age of 30 or 35. And that's like, anyone under that age has just been fed a steady diet of dystopian fiction, from Hunger Games to the latest Star Wars movies to like anything that's come out of Hollywood in the last sort of 20 years. So her impression was that people's imaginations were sort of suffused with that kind of storyline. My interpretation, which is a friendly addendum to that, is that like, if you already live in a dystopia, which I think most Amazon workers do, then it makes sense that you would write about dystopia. Like their physical embodied and social atmosphere is dystopian. And so on some level, I think they express that in their fiction. I would say there is a critical dystopian moment, and it comes in all of the stories, which is that there's always quite a heartwarming moment of like solidarity between a small group or a family, or a nostalgia or a wish for those moments of solidarity. So the utopian moment is like just a kind of redemptive kernel, I think, and it comes in the actual social relations rather than in some sort of mass movement or uprising or better world that's built. Yeah, and I think that is also indicative both of how people live their lives, that especially in North America, there's no more society, there's just people and their family, to paraphrase Margaret Thatcher. So that's where people's imaginations take root, that's where their imaginations are rooted. But also that's the form of solidarity that they experience in their everyday life, and their imaginations grip onto that. And I think it just speaks to the lack of narratives and images we have in this society of movements, of collective movements, of forms of struggle that don't have leaders or whose leaders are responsible or that sort of thing. The dystopian imagination is just really, really strong for both ideological and material reasons.
Excellent. Well, not excellent, but very sad in words.
Sad, yeah.
But
Hashtag
on that
sad,
theory
yeah.
note, Stevens.
We're looking for someone online. I'm gonna pause the recording.
But you're always chairing, so
We're back.
Stephen, do you want to ask your question and then see who else is?
I will hold my question until we get sandwiches.
Ooh, okay. Was there anyone else online? That was an excellent question, by the way. It wasn't rambling at all, Chris. It was fantastic. Instead of insights and really needed. Is anyone online or in the room? Oh, in the back?
Great.
Part of what's been just said before, I want to get back to the idea of the escapism. I think you're thinking it very negatively, but just because I was just reading a bit about like feminism, the future of feminism, basically. So this escapism, I think, is actually helpful. It can be very positive, focused on the past, like escaping the system that actually exploits you. And this is, I think, where this imagination, radical imagination, comes in to think about what could be our, common goal, because it's also said that there's seems to be a lack of common goal that we should be fighting for, but on the left, like this. So I think my question basically is just like from all these projects you were talking about earlier, the one with Amazon or the and everything, is there anything lasting, anything that developed from this? Is there anything where you're like, okay, that what's the development into more activists?
Good question. Well, let me echo by saying that I really do also believe in escapism in the good sense of like escape of the imagination from the confines of the like imperialism of the now. I'm really into that. And I'm really exploring it a lot in the project on games because I'm interested in board games and fun. I'm interested in radical fun. Maybe just because I'm bored, I don't know. But I think it's actually like, and it's one of the reasons I want to intervene and figure out ways to work with these escapist spaces. I think they're really important. And I think especially coming out of like multiple waves of feminism, different forms of thinking through like joy, thinking through pleasure, thinking through sociality, conviviality in different ways, I think is really inspiring and important. And then in terms of the lasting impact, it's a bit hard to say. I mean, a number of the people that we worked with in the Radical Imagination Project went on to do many other things, as people do from social movements. Some of them are now working in government, some of them are working in academia, some of them are working in policy, some of them have disappeared, some of them are running organic farms, some of them have gone and played for the other side. I don't know if we could take credit for any of that, But I do feel, and I think when I talk to some of the participants 10 years later, lots of people feel like it was an important moment in their development. It was especially important that we asked this question, like, what would it mean to win? And that they got to articulate that. And that did, for some people told me, start a shift in their thinking, because they're like, wait, actually, what are we doing? Why are we doing this? But I don't know, again, I wouldn't take credit for that. I think in the Workers' Futurist project, it's still maybe too early to tell. One of the people who participated quit or got fired from Amazon and became a labor organizer for the Migrant Workers Center in Montreal. Another of them joined Amazonians United, which is a kind of rank and file solidarity union. They don't go for like official business union status. They sort of do worker to worker solidarity. A third one of those became very involved in sort of the left wing of the Democratic Party in Chicago. A bunch of the other ones just disappeared, and who knows where they went, and they don't contact us. Some of them didn't seem to change at all. I don't think we can take credit for those people like quitting their jobs and joining movements, but I think it was I would like to think it was part of that. But I don't know. And I think that in the next phase of that Workers' Futurist project, we would love to work. Well, and we're beginning negotiations to work with actual organizations that are organizing and seeing how we can supplement their efforts. Because I think this kind of cultural, ideological, and imaginative work rarely has a kind of like eureka, aha moment where somebody has a massive transformation. Or if we do have that, we can't really take credit for it because it was percolating and building before that. We were just the spark that ignited it, hopefully. Yeah. Yeah.
We have a
Yeah.
question over here. I should also say, because two people mentioned it, just on the thing that I think some of this work, and I know that we talked about this previously, there's a very interesting distinction between, I think, abolitionist escapism, which I think is part of these traditions and what we're working on, and capitalist escapism, and understanding how those are and how those are can actually be integrated within practices of, as Chris was saying, everyday workshops and things like this. But
Yeah.
absolutely, it's a good point. I'm probably going to ask, 'cause I'm tired. I should have made that clear.
Genevieve has asked
Oh.
for the details of the historical materialism, which you can't find and I can't find, so I'm guessing you know.
I do know. So at 4:30 tomorrow on Thursday, I will be running a game making workshop for radicals at Historical Materialism. It is, if you go to the Historical Materialism Conference, which is happening at SOAS in London, from 4:30 to almost 7 o'clock, we're running that session. And then from 7 o'clock until late, we're going to be at the Institute, which is the name of a pub on UCL's campus. And we're going to be playing Billionaires and Guillotines. We're going to be playing Mateo's award-winning game Daybreak, which is fantastic. He made it with a person who designed Pandemic. For those of you who are in the board game world, it's a very exciting thing. And we'll also be playing other radical board games. So yeah, 7 p.m. is the board game night at the Institute. And more information's going around today about that. There's some of it on my Substack, I think.
We have time for one last question.
Yeah, it was, I don't know, talking about the dystopian imagination and the workers and the projects you have, I was just wondering, I don't study this, so maybe someone has already answered this. But do the type of stories that are created and co-formed with the workers and whatever, now these were more dystopian, but you don't know what will happen in other unions, no? Or workers. Do you think they could affect the way workers are mobilized and the type of mobilization they do and the way they organize, and some people, you know, more defeated and leave, or if they're more optimistic, they'll start working. But I don't know, do you think the type of things that you co-create might affect?
I hope so. I hope so. And that's what I really want to find out in the next phase of the project, if we get to work with the workers who are organizing. My suspicion is yes, but it might not be direct. I don't think necessarily that people with a kind of positive or utopian imagination, there'll be any direct connection or correlation between that and their success as organizers. In fact, I have a suspicion that maybe the organizers need a moment to express their pessimism, because I think when you're a labor organizer, you need to be optimistic a lot of the time. Like you're going to the workers and be like, don't worry, you know, we're going to sign a card, but then things are going to get better. You know, this is going to happen. You know, you need to actually be quite, in my experience at least, you're not unrealistic. You're not lying to people, but you're trying to present things in a positive light. And maybe those organizers need a space where they can be like, actually, here's my nightmare scenario, or like, yeah. So I don't think it will necessarily be direct, but I do think it'll be helpful. I have a hunch that it will be helpful. In a best case scenario, it'll be helpful because if the organizers and workers come together to imagine different futures, they might realize that that part of the dignity of labor is to reclaim a power to have some control over your future. And I've been toying with this idea of dignity and dignity of labor. It's like an old saying from the trade union movement, but I think it's actually really significant when thinking about the imagination. Because part of like working at Amazon, why it's so undignified and so humiliating on some level is because when you're working at Amazon, as the workers told us, they're basically treating you as an exploitable body. Like there's no way you could imagine yourself as anything other than kind of meat in a hybrid cyborg machine. And it is fundamentally like degrading to the human. I mean, we can problematize the notion of the human here in university, etc. But like on some deep embodied level, when you work at Amazon, you feel alienation in your bones when you go home every day from work. So I think actually exercising the imagination is about cultivating a kind of dignity to be like, actually, my imagination is worth something. My mind is worth something. And my social mind is worth something. And I think even if they don't come up with beautiful visions that inspire people to join unions, I think even just bringing people together in a space and creating the resources and the infrastructure for them to feel dignity again on some level is worth it in and of itself. Because I think then people are like, the world can be better. You know,
It's like the process, not the grinding or whatever.
I think so. Yeah, not the product. It's the process of the conviviality itself that I think is valuable. Yeah.
Revolution is always the means, never the end.
That's right.
Thank you, everyone, in person. Unfortunately for the people online, we haven't developed the Star Trek technology to actually give you the free food where you're at. But thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for all your great comments. And hopefully we'll see some of you at the game, radical game of historical materialism.
Pluto's buying the drinks.
And for everyone else here, we have freshly made sandwiches and juice and coffee and water. So nothing says excitement more than that.
The imagination itself.
Yes, yes. The British are very imaginative in terms of their catering. And what they
so much,
consider
everyone.
edible food. But I want to really thank you, Max. Max is going to be here at UCL, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, up until May. So this will hopefully definitely not be the last time that we all get together with Cover and that we start promoting this. But this was really incredible. And I do think that this is the exact type of work and practice we need to be doing more of.
Thank you.
So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Let me leave here.